I was born in Hyde Park, so I have long-standing ties to Chicago, and I'm really delighted to be back at the Humanities Festival. So there's a couple of ways I do not use the term liberalism. One is in the American sense of, left of center progressivism. It's also not used in the European sense of a center-right party that's pro-free market but socially progressive. And least of all is it used in the sense of libertarian, which I think is a peculiarly American phenomenon where people just dislike the government across the board. My definition of liberalism really stems from its original origins in the middle of the 17th century, when it emerged as a doctrine that was meant to recover from the wars of religion that had occurred in Europe over the preceding 150 years following the Protestant Reformation. It's basically a doctrine that says we should lower the sights of politics so that it's not aiming at the good life, but simply to preserve life itself in societies that are diverse. At that time, it was religious diversity. In later centuries, it would be national diversity. We live in diverse societies, so we need to create a system in which we can live together in peace, where tolerance is the chief virtue. And a liberal political order is one that is institutionalized by a rule of law that limits the power of governments over individuals, and by a constitutional system of checks and balances that prevents executive power from being too strong, and thereby protecting a sphere of autonomy for individuals. In my view, it's compatible with different kinds of economic policies. So I would say that Sweden and Denmark, two social democratic states, in my view, are liberal societies, as is the United States or Japan or other countries that don't have the same level of social protections. They're all liberal because they've got that constraint really on the power of the state that provides protections for our individual rights.
Thanks. I guess we should get to, in a way, the discontents. What are the challenges on left and right today to liberalism, and not just to it as an ism, but to the actual liberal policies and practices of this society?
Well, I think that the threats to liberalism have been very evident in the last few years, and they come from both the right and the left. On the right, there's an unhappiness, I think, with the central feature of liberalism. I mean, a liberal society does not define, the higher ends of human society or human life. And people oftentimes want that, either in terms of a common religious belief or a national identity that is very thick and gives people a lot to hold in common. Sometimes based on things like fixed characteristics like race or religion or ethnicity. And there's a longing for that sense of community that exists when the whole nation seems to be pulling in the same direction. You've seen the rise of a lot of illiberal forces in recent years. Geopolitically, you've got Russia and China now that are major powers that are decidedly illiberal. Vladimir Putin gave an interview to the Financial Times back in 2019 in which he said liberalism is an obsolete doctrine. And he has been creating a very illiberal society, I think, whose effects you can see in all of the dissidents that are now in jail, the absence of a free press, the absence of any kinds of checks on his power, and a similar kind of system has been put in place in China. But you also have illiberal forces in ostensibly democratic countries. So Prime Minister Modi in India has taken what was basically created as a very liberal regime in post-war in the Indian Republic and tried to turn it into a Hindu state in which Hindutva, this ideology built around Hinduism, becomes the source of national identity, which is fine if you're a Hindu, but if you're one of the 200 million Muslims living in India, it's not so great because you've seen your civil rights taken away. Kashmir has had its right as a state reduced and so forth. And, you can see in that situation, the original purpose of liberalism, was to prevent violence between people of different religious sects, and that threat is really very present in Modi's India. And, I think in our country, you have a right-wing nationalist movement that was led by our former president, Donald Trump, that has a lot of sympathy with these very illiberal forces. He somehow seems to be a big fan of, actually I shouldn't say somehow, I think I know why he's a fan of Putin, because Putin is a leader who can basically do whatever he wants. After Russia invaded Ukraine, he said, well, that was brilliant. He just declared these two republics in the eastern Ukraine independent, and he could just do that. I wish we could do something like that on our southern border, right? And so there's a hankering after that kind of unconstrained authority that I think is underlying a lot of the populist nationalists that have arisen. Viktor Orban in Hungary, Marine Le Pen in France. All of these people are, in the end, illiberal, deeply illiberal in that sense. So that's I think, the threat on the right. The threat on the left is different because you've seen over the years the rise of or shift in progressive thought, where inequality is no longer the general characteristic of a broad social class like the proletariat or the working class, but has been located in specific marginalized groups. So African Americans, women, gays, lesbian, LGBTQ people and the like. And there's really two versions of this, one of which I think is actually quite liberal. So I would say that's the Martin Luther King understanding, for example, of racial equality, that King in his famous 1964 speech said, I'm looking forward to the day when my children will be judged on the basis of the content of their characters rather than the color of their skin. And so the plea was that a liberal society that claims to treat all people equally under the law actually live up to those promises, and that the motive behind identity politics was to mobilize people to push for that kind of liberal equality. However, there's another version of identity politics that I think has become illiberal, that argues that these identities, these group identities that we're born with and where we don't have any choice, like our race, our ethnicity, our gender, and so forth, are so important to the way that we think about the world and the way the world treats us that they become kind of essential characteristics, and that the society as a whole should look to those characteristics, those group characteristics, rather than to what people are as individuals. And that, I think, undermines a basic liberal premise of the kind of universal equality, moral equality of people regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, and so forth. And that's led to a kind of left-wing politics that has become, in many cases, intolerant of people that don't ascribe to the orthodoxy, and also willing to violate, due process and other liberal principles. So, you have these two threats. I would say between the two of them, the much bigger and more immediate one is the one coming from the right. I mean, we can talk about this, maybe in the Q&A, because I really do think that there's a very live danger to American liberal democracy in the way that, the Republicans are preparing for the next upcoming election and the way votes will be counted and the like. And that's a clear and present danger. I think the one that comes from the progressive left is a cultural one that is not as immediate, but I do think is still, quite significant in the way that Americans think about themselves and their relation to each other.
I'm not quite sure how to put this. Sort of, what did liberalism do to deserve these attacks? What are its vulnerabilities? Why doesn't it provide the kind of community and unity that the right demands, or the kind of group recognition that the left demands?
Well, I think that there are, several answers to that. The social justice demands of the left, I think, are rooted in the nature of liberalism. In some sense, it becomes kind of inevitable, because liberalism is based on law. It's based on a rule of law that limits the ability of rulers to simply do what they want, and over time it tends to get very procedural. And so things don't happen quickly, right? And if you look at the history of the United States, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments gave, in theory, African Americans juridical equality and rights equal to white people. And yet, after the southern states were readmitted after the 1876 election, all of that was taken back in the South, and you had legal segregation. And it took another 100 years until the civil rights movement in the 1960s for that to be, finally corrected. And that's a really long time. And I think, even after that correction, it still remains the case that, de facto inequality is still very present in our society, that we've seen in, police violence and other, and disparate economic outcomes and so forth. And so I think a lot of the frustration on the part of progressives is with that slowness, the fact that liberalism protects everybody's rights and guarantees the right to vote of everybody, including their political opponents that are also equally mobilized and can block things that they would like to see happen. And so I think, that's a genuine feature of a liberal society. It requires deliberation, argument. It tends to move slowly. I think that the response that I would make as to why that's acceptable is to consider what the opposite is. Because if you unconstrain the government to do things, you're also unconstraining it to do bad things, right? And I would think that actually the checks and balances in a liberal political order are kind of like an insurance policy. They're there in order to prevent a really bad leader from doing really bad things. If you want to see a really bad leader making bad decisions, look at Mao Zedong in China, launches the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution because there are no checks and balances in that system that does, incredible damage to Chinese society from which in a certain way they still haven't recovered. Whereas in, a system with those procedural checks, you can't get away with that sort of thing, or at least not for a long time. And if you think about Donald Trump, a lot of things he wanted to do, he couldn't. He couldn't build his border wall. He couldn't get rid of Obamacare. He actually couldn't subvert the last election because you actually did have a federal judiciary that was, pretty good about telling him, no, you can't throw out these election results. And so that's the problem, is that you want to protect yourself on the downside, but it also limits, your ability on the upside to do social change very rapidly. But I think that in the end, because there is a record of progress over time, it's worth having those, in a way, those safety features in your political system.
What do you think or hope should be done to save liberalism from these two challenges or threats? Does liberalism itself have to change or be moderated in order to survive?
Well, what I argue in the book is that what happened over the last 50 years was that there were two deformations of liberalism that were not necessary and not intrinsic in the doctrine, one on the right and one on the left, and that in order to save liberalism, in a way, what you have to do is walk those back or moderate them in some sense. So the deformation on the right was when economic liberalism became what's now called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is not capitalism. I don't think that you can have a modern, progressive, entrepreneurial, growth-oriented economic system without property rights and without competition. But what happened beginning in the 1970s and 80s was you had the growth of a movement represented by Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and I must say here in Chicago, people like Milton Friedman and the rest of the Chicago school that took things to extremes. So all modern economic systems need markets, but in a sense, neoliberalism began to worship the market and to denigrate the state in ways that were very destructive by deregulating and privatizing. The state lost control. It created a great deal of economic inequality. The deregulation led directly to the 2008 subprime crisis that then left millions of Americans, out of their homes, where the elites did pretty well and recovered after a few years. And so I think a lot of the anger on both the right and the left comes from that. We had a form of globalization in which corporations would export jobs, at the drop of a hat. If they could get the slightest efficiency advantage, the job would move from one country to another, and that had a devastating effect on many working class communities, obviously here in the United States, and so people's anger at that was understandable. I think that on the left, you had a comparable, celebration of autonomy, and in a way, it was a kind of celebration of autonomy for its own sake. People, the original, I think, understanding of autonomy is that we are moral beings, autonomous, but within an established moral framework. And so I think this actually it's deeply embedded in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Adam and Eve are cast out of the Garden of Eden because they disobey God's word, but it means, although they disobey, that they're moral creatures and they have an ability to judge between right and wrong. That's what happened when they ate from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And, from that moment on, they are moral creatures that have the ability to make a distinction between right and wrong. And that's what gives every individual, a basic level of human dignity. But the traditional understanding of that was we have the ability to choose within a framework that we don't establish ourselves. But as time went on, in Western thought, it was the autonomy itself that became the end-all and be-all and not the substance of what was being chosen. And this leads to, a couple of different things. I mean, what's called expressive individualism, in which we're not just choosing, to live by the rules or not, but we want to be able to make up the rules ourselves. And then this becomes, very destructive of existing norms and rules and cultural traditions, where basically every social, you can't have society without rules, but if you want complete individual autonomy, there's going to be somebody that's going to object to those rules and want to impose others. And so that also, I think, was a deformation of an original, basic, necessary idea that was part of liberalism. And like neoliberalism on the right, I think this kind of view of autonomy was carried to extremes, on the left.
Well, you've very eloquently described what went wrong to liberalism, but what can we do now? Is it plausible to get rid of the neo part and go back to the more moderate liberalism? Is it possible to reduce autonomy to something that works within a moral framework? Practically, how does one undo the processes you've described?
Well, on the neoliberalism part, in terms of economic policy, I think that's actually pretty easy. And I think we're already partway there to undoing it. because I don't think that the kind of, Chicago school free market ideology is at all dominant anymore in economic thought or policy. And it's actually relatively easy. I think already the Biden administration has opened the floodgates, to government support for, different kinds of social protections. And that's been going on in Europe as well, where there's a much greater, willingness to have state intervention in economies to re-regulate, in antitrust. One of the things that the Chicago school was responsible for was the growth of these enormous corporations, including big internet platforms, and under the view that they were simply efficient and there was nothing wrong with these huge concentrations of economic power. Now the European Union has taken the lead in trying to, really rein these companies in and, in some cases break them up, but certainly try to limit their power. So that part of it is already happening. On the other side, I think one of the things that can be done has to do with the question of nation and national identity. And that's one respect in which I think our understanding of our identities can be walked back from the kind of extreme fragmentation that is produced by, one version of identity politics. So I think that liberalism and national identity, in one sense, seem to be in conflict with one another, because liberals believe that all human beings, qua human beings, have rights, and that everybody's right, universally around the world, should be respected, whether that's in Myanmar, Bangladesh, or here in the United States. And so the question then is, how do you reconcile that with the fact that we're divided into nations and we actually don't worry about Bangladesh or Myanmar? We're primarily concerned with the United States or people much closer to us. And I think that those ideas are actually compatible. And indeed, I think that liberalism actually needs the nation and national identity if it's actually going to be effective. And the reason for that is that the nation remains the only legitimate level of social organization that can actually deploy coercive power. This is really what nation states are about. It's the legitimate monopoly of force. This was Max Weber's famous definition of the state. A legitimate monopoly of force in terms of armies, police, that remain necessary if you're actually going to enforce rights and if you're going to deliver services and do things that people expect in liberal societies. You have to have that ability to enforce. We organize that right now on a national basis. We have international organizations, but they don't actually have that, control, and we don't know how to control them at an international level. Whereas we do have rule of law, we do have courts, we have various constraints on national power, and therefore that's really the only safe level at which we can actually use power. The other thing is an emotional question. People are most loyal to those that are immediately around them, friends and family, and that attachment attenuates. I just think that this is a feature of human, it's kind of one of our native emotional faculties. That closeness attenuates the further people are away from us. And right now, I think it's really the nation that is kind of the largest social unit to which people feel an immediate and strong emotional attachment. And therefore, if you want to have social cohesion, it really has to be attached to an actual nation. Again, I don't want to keep referring to Ukraine, but if you think about why is it that Ukrainians are right now fighting and dying in such heroic measure against this Russian invasion, they're not fighting for an abstract ideal of democracy or liberal democracy. Very few people actually do that. But it's not the case that they're simply fighting, for Ukrainian sovereignty and they don't care what kind of government rules them in Ukraine. I think, this is on the basis of having visited Ukraine a lot over the last 7, 8 years, I think they're fighting for a certain version of Ukrainian national identity that is not Putin's view of it. It's a free society. You know, it culturally has a lot of Slavic roots, but it is a free society in a way that Russia is not, and they simply would not fight and die the way they are if it were not embedded in a specific country called Ukraine that, you know, that is theirs. But that national identity that you're willing to die for really has to be a liberal one. It cannot be based on a fixed characteristic like ethnicity or race or the religion that you're born with. So, for example, Viktor Orban in Hungary has defined Hungarian national identity as based on Hungarian ethnicity. So, what's the problem with that? Well, I can illustrate it with the following little anecdote. There was a famous meeting that took place in the 1930s. No, this must have been actually after the start of World War II between Franklin Roosevelt and these 4 Hungarian very famous physicists, Edward Teller, John von Neumann, Leo Szilard, and Eugene Wigner, right? All Nobel Prize winners, and all of them Hungarian Jews that grew up in the liberal Austro-Hungarian Empire before the Second World War. And by Viktor Orban's definition of Hungarian national identity, they weren't Hungarians. You know, they weren't part of that national identity. And, you know, that's what I think it means to have a liberal national identity. It has to be inclusive of the actual diversity of the people that live in your society and that are citizens of it, and open, you know, to citizenship by, a diverse group of people. And that's really the kind of nation that I think we need to be striving for. And so, you know, liberals cannot let the idea of nation be appropriated by the right. They're bad forms of nationalism. They're exclusive, aggressive forms of nationalism. But, you know, there are liberal forms of it, and I think that's one thing that can be, you know, realistically recaptured from, you know, a certain identitarian understanding of what our society is.
Okay. I have a question that in a way goes beyond the bounds of your book. Is the responsibility for the revival or survival of classical liberalism solely a matter of public policy and what states do, or does it have implications for how we as individuals have to behave? Does respect for toleration, for rule of law, for process and procedure, for individuality or individualism have implications for how we should treat each other, especially those we disagree with or who are members of various ascriptive groups other than our own?
No, absolutely. So this is one of these truisms, you know, that politics is downstream of culture, and culture, in a way, is downstream of certain, you know, master ideas. And I think that if people do not have the right habits, you know, that's really what culture is all about. It's kind of morals and habits and habitual ways of doing things. Then the politics isn't going to work, and therefore the liberal institutions aren't going to work. As I said, you know, liberalism is built around a single cardinal virtue, and that is a virtue of toleration. And there's a lot of intolerance in our country at the moment. So on the right, you've had the revival of a kind of ethno-nationalism, you know, where kind of race and ethnicity become defining characteristics of what it means to be an American, and, you know, a lot of the energy on the right is driven by opposition to immigration and the idea that our ethnic and demographic balance is changing. And I think that conservatives need to get over that. You know, they really need to divorce their understanding of American identity from, you know, those kinds of racial and ethnic categories and move to a more liberal one. So they need to be more tolerant. I think on the left, there's a comparable intolerance. That's not based on ethnicity, race, gender. It's based on your political and kind of religious orientations. And so there's a lot of people on the left that are willing to write off a lot of their fellow Americans as being just racist or nativist, sexist, and so forth, and therefore not really part of the tolerable political community. And so I think that, if you're really going to be tolerant, both of these sides need to, think about that a little bit more. I would say beyond that, there have to be certain positive, active virtues that are necessary to sustain a liberal society. A liberal society depends not on unanimity, but it does depend on deliberation and the ability to civilly discuss things, to compromise, to come to agreements. And that sort of thing, you look at Congress these days, it's gone, right? It just doesn't exist, unfortunately, in our, our major institutions. But I think it's also gradually disappearing in the society as a whole, and that's something that's really our responsibility to cultivate, to have a sense of civic responsibility that incorporates the liberal virtues of tolerance and moderation in order to get back to a politics that will be, more genuinely liberal.
Well, it's always a pleasure to converse with Frank Fukuyama. I can't help but mention we've been doing it since the early 70s when he was a graduate student and I was a young faculty member at Harvard, and in the early 80s when we were colleagues in the policy planning staff of the State Department. And I always learn and am stimulated to further thought by doing so. I think at this point I get to enjoy his responses to your questions. What happens?
We have a question,
Okay.
yeah, a couple down in the front
here. I have a
here.
microphone out here. I'm going to have a first question right over here.
Where there's a mobile mic somewhere?
Yeah. Hello? Should I stand up?
Okay. The gentleman in the front row.
Here. Wait. I'm back here. Yeah. Hi.
Okay.
Okay. Sure. Hi. So, from what I understand, you're saying that there's this interplay between tolerance and and sort of these violences that we want to restrict on the basis of tolerance, right? And it seems to me that a lot of disagreement manifests under the terms of liberalism. For instance, on the left, you might have people contending that certain things are rights that historically maybe have not been attested to be rights or aren't in the Constitution or the UN Declaration or whatever other historical document that people on the right might say, well, that's not a right. You can't just say it's a right because it's that. And then on the other hand, on the right, you might have people who agree to tolerance in principle, but then to them, there's certain things we all agree on, like the race that you're born with is something you should tolerate, but then something that historically attaches to that, like certain cultural practices, is not something that should be tolerated, right? It leads to a certain kind of tokenism where as long as you act white or, you are Christian or embody these certain practices, that's fine. And so how do we litigate those differences within the framework of liberalism without passing to something that's sort of prior to the declarations of rights or the declarations of categories that we ought to tolerate?
Well, that's a pretty complicated question to answer. So on the question of rights, part of it is easy to answer because we actually have one of the first constitutions that actually had, a clear written statement of the original Bill of Rights that then gets interpreted by the courts and extended and modified. There are ways of constitutionally, modifying that original document. We don't rely on that very often, but we do rely on the courts to reinterpret, and that gives at least a certain structure and puts certain bounds on what are considered rights. I don't know whether beneath your question was a reference to the current controversy over abortion and the way that the Supreme Court has answered that, because a lot of conservatives would say, as you said, that the right to privacy on which the right to abortion was built is not in the original Bill of Rights, and it was kind of invented by Justice Douglas and so forth. But the thing about rights is that in any society, in a way, they're not handed down on a tablet necessarily by God. They're kind of what people really believe are rights. And I think that part of the controversy right now is that having made that original assertion of a right to abortion back in the 1970s, it existed for 50 years, and a lot of people believe that it is a fundamental right. And under a principle of stare decisis, it's not, it's a kind of intrusion into some basic, very strongly held feelings. If a court then decides, well, actually, we're going to take that right away from you after a couple of generations of observing it. But I would be the first to admit that it is an area of a lot of contestation, because the way that rights are subsequently interpreted by courts is very controversial, and that's part of the reason that our court system has become as politicized as it is, because it's become actually an area of fundamental political contestation, and not simply an area of interpretation of existing statute law. I don't know whether that answered the question or not, but.
So here, do you think that use of nuclear weapons by Putin or Russia, generally speaking, will mean end of history?
No, I honestly do not believe that. So first of all, I do not think that it is likely that Putin will use nuclear weapons. It does not make any kind of either tactical or strategic sense, and there's no way, I think, that he could do that and actually improve his position or, survive politically. In fact, I think this would be clearly the end of Putinism if he were to do this. So I actually don't think that the risk of nuclear escalation is that high, but I wouldn't be the first to say that, we should be very careful, because that possibility exists. But I do think that, there are a lot of very severe dangers in the world today, not just from nuclear weapons, but, pandemics, global warming, and so forth. All of them are potentially civilization-threatening developments, and I would not assert that liberalism is a solution for every problem that we're going to encounter, as a human civilization. It's just that it seems to be a better way of proceeding than all of the alternatives, which are some version of authoritarianism. And I think that, in a way, what's going on in Ukraine right now is proving that, that kind of unconstrained, illiberal authoritarianism leads to international aggression, to war, and to the possibility of escalation and a lot of other calamities. And that's one of the reasons we should prefer governments that are constrained by law and that do observe certain limits.
Here, up front.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Fukuyama. My question is, do you think, and I think you sort of alluded to it, that there is call it a competition going on between the autocrats and call them Democrats, particularly with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, okay? The Chinese are basically trying to
demonstrate that their system is more efficient. Okay? And therefore superior. This is my read on it. And Putin is looking at, the strength of his, call it autocracy. And then which way do you see this going? I mean, even the Chinese probably are the dominant power because they're influencing the Russians in terms of AI.
Yeah.
So that
Well, okay. Let me stop you and say that I agree with the initial assertion that you made, which is that there is a global contest going on between liberal democracies and authoritarian powers, not just Russia and China, but you've got Iran, Venezuela, Syria. There's a long list of countries that have moved in this authoritarian direction in the last decade, and it's a very, very worrying trend. And I think you're right that especially China argues for its own system on the basis of its economic growth record, its stability, and so forth. But I think that actually it's not clear whether any of these authoritarian systems are really so good and so sustainable. And I think you can see that just in the stuff that's happened in the last couple of months, right? That both Putin and Xi Jinping are pretty unconstrained autocrats. Putin more than Xi. Xi, at least in the Chinese system, there are still some, rules about how the Communist Party operates, but Xi has been trying to dismantle those by giving himself, a third term and staying on as president of China rather than turning over power as previous Chinese rulers have done. And look at what it's bought them. You've got this completely crazy zero COVID policy that's locked down Shanghai, a city of 25 million people, separated parents from their children, old people dying because they can't get to the hospital. And it seems to me it's largely the result of the personal vanity of this one leader who committed himself to this policy that isn't working, but he can't say that he was wrong about it. Even bigger mistake, just a monumental mistake made by Putin. The table, the 20-foot long table that he was famously seated at indicates the kind of isolation and paranoia that apparently he's been affected by over the last, especially since COVID hit. And so he's not listening to good advice on the part of anybody. And it's hard to imagine that anyone, even in his closest, highest military and security circles, can go to him and say, well, Vladimir, I actually think you're wrong about this, or you need to be a little careful. Maybe things in Ukraine aren't going to work out as well as you think they will. Nobody can say that. And as a result, they've made, one of the most colossal foreign policy blunders or strategic blunders of any country. They're actually going to have a larger NATO at the end of this than when they started this invasion, when Finland and Sweden joined. So, this is what makes me think that there is this global fight going on. It's not so obvious that these unconstrained authoritarian regimes actually make better decisions and actually lead to better results for their own people.
Thank both of you for this wonderful conversation. Good to see you, Professor Tarcov. So you mentioned that the two big challenges to liberalism in America seem to kind of have like a left-right valence. I'm curious about a third possibility, which is something we've been kind of grappling with over the last few years, which is the possibility of the sort of, in a liberalism of the modern scientific enterprise, the question of technocracy. This is something that's been written into the project from the very beginning. I'm thinking of the sort of vision of the world given in Bacon's New Atlantis, right, of experts ruling without any sort of question of legitimacy exactly. So I wonder if you can just say a little bit about sort of technocracy and the kind of scientific liberalism, and especially the question of legitimacy. If liberalism is predicated on legitimacy of sort of popular sovereignty, elected representatives, so on and so forth, the scientific, technocratic thing is not so much. So just wondering if you can share a couple thoughts.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you raised that because that's one of the critical challenges that's going on right now. So liberalism in its original form was closely associated with a certain cognitive mode that we call modern natural science, in which, people believe that there's an objective world outside of their subjective consciousness and that they can apprehend that world through a scientific method and then manipulate it. And, it's been one of the most successful methods over the years. It's what produces technology, the Industrial Revolution, the computer revolution. All of these things proceed from this belief in a kind of empirical natural science and then its practical application in technology. Now, what's happened, I have a whole chapter in my book that traces the origin, that there's a lot of skepticism about science, and it really begins kind of on the left in this transition from structuralism to post-structuralism to postmodernism, and then to different versions of critical theory in which you have a increasing skepticism about the objectivity of science. And it really comes to a kind of fruition and a culmination in the writings of Michel Foucault, who in his idea of biopower basically says, in the old days, autocrats would exert power by just killing somebody that they didn't like. They could openly use power, but today we use a more subtle means. We convince people that something is scientifically true when it's actually being manipulated by elites, and he gives a lot of examples of this in terms of views about incarceration, homosexuality, different forms of marginalization that were supposedly scientifically validated, but in fact were simply means of elites keeping people down. And I think that, in a sense, he was the original conspiracy theorist. Now, the tone of your question indicates that, there's some reasonable grounds for being skeptical about technocrats and about modern science, and I think that's perfectly right, because, in fact, modern natural science is it's an ongoing process, and I live in this very liberal neighborhood in Palo Alto, and there are all these lawn signs saying, "I believe in science," and I think that that's also a kind of naive point of view, because science doesn't speak in one voice. It's constantly modifying itself, and so in the course of the pandemic, the public health community has gone through, as more research has been done, they've changed their guidance on should we wear masks or not, indoors, outdoors, vaccines, all these things about public safety, and so it makes people a little bit skeptical about, technocrats and whether they know what they're doing. But I think you have to ask yourself, so that skepticism is perfectly justified, but you have to ask yourself, what if the Foucaultian version, that this kind of manipulation pervades all of natural science and therefore we should be distrustful of science as a whole, what is going to replace that? And I'll tell you what replaces it. Basically, it's the modern internet, right? Because what the modern internet did was it took away all of the hierarchical filters like legacy media, peer-reviewed scientific journals, and basically anyone can assert anything they want, and people will take it as gospel, and it's that erosion, not just of a common belief in higher values, but just a common belief in what's factual is really now a big problem for all of us. Are vaccines safe? Who won the 2020 election, presidential election in the United States, right? These are all things that I think 20, 30 years ago there wouldn't have been any dissent about, and today, they're all being questioned by a lot of people, and a lot of the Foucaultian skepticism about science has now drifted from the left to the right, where people on the right are saying, the public health authorities aren't interested in your health, they're just interested in power. That's almost word for word, Foucault's understanding of the nature of science. They're simply elites that want to manipulate you and get you to do what they want and therefore don't believe them. And I think that world is a pretty scary world, you know, where you don't actually have a fundamental belief, not in science as something that's authoritative and tells you what the truth is, but a process that gives you the best shot at understanding, you know, the nature of that external world. And that's one of the big challenges to liberalism, is this disintegration of our kind of consensus, at least about, you know, empirical, you know, what are the grounds of empirical reality, and you know, how do we get to agreement on those basic facts?
Feels like a lot of threats to our society. Are there any policy prescriptions or societal, cultural prescriptions you can think of? It feels like you're describing a really fractured view of liberalism, one that has a perception on the right and on the left, and that we may not even be able to recognize warning signs because we view them, those warnings, so differently. Is there anything that you kind of prescriptively feel are remedies? I think I'm speaking mostly of the United States.
Well, so I deliberately didn't write a policy-oriented book. I mean, I work in a policy institute, and I've done public policy my whole life. And if I wanted to write that book, it would be a very long one, because there are a lot of ideas about things I mean, for example, I'm a big proponent of ranked choice voting. I think that you would have a much less polarized Congress and political system if you didn't have a first-past-the-post electoral system the way we do. And so there's a lot of things, you know, campaign finance and, you know, gerrymandering and so forth, that you could think that would actually improve the nature of the political system. I deliberately am writing on a different level because, as I said, I think that ideas and culture are upstream of actual policy, and if you don't get the you know, the underlying ideas right, then you're not going to get the policies right, and therefore I'm kind of addressing, you know, a kind of different level of discourse. So yeah, I do think there are, you know, concrete things, there are institutional changes that we could undertake that would ease our situation. I think in terms of the cognitive problems I was talking about, we have to actually reinsert a certain degree of hierarchy in the way that we perceive the world and realize that not all sources of information are equally credible, and that, you know, you do have to have certain kinds of filters and constraints. And I think, you know, we haven't quite figured out how to do that yet, but, you know, I don't think it's an unsolvable problem.
I trust you will all join me in thanking Dr. Fukuyama.